So the key point of confusion that I find is around what the agents are. And I often come back to this, to the thought by Whitehead. He put this down. He said, civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking of them. And this is sort of what happens here. It's really the extension of the things that you as a human or your organization or we as a civilization can do without thinking. So my thesis is very simple here. We build agents to extend our own agency beyond the limits imposed by intelligence, memory, time, space, speed, energy, availability, whatever it is. What does this mean? Let's take a very simple, practical example. I'm terrible at keeping good connections with a wider range of friends. I'm fairly decent at a small group of friends, but terrible with a wider range of friends. And so here's the limitation of my own agency in terms of attention span. Like, I don't send them birthday cards or whatnot. Like, it's just not, it doesn't come to my mind. But I think it is important to keep in touch, and I don't want it to be a complete sort of token thing. And so that's a silly example, but it's a practical one. There is a limitation imposed by my capacity, my memory, my intelligence, my time, whatever you want to call it. I do want to extend that capacity. And so this is an example where I can go, oh, can I build a thing, or can I make a thing that will actually solve that for me? And I don't have to think about that. The fact that I don't have to think about that does not mean that I don't have to care about that. And I think this is a very important distinction when thinking and caring. So I don't have to think about that means I don't have to remember it. And I don't have to like spend 2 hours and scratch my head about what is it that I'm going to send to them in terms of the birthday card. But I do care enough to look at the birthday cards and then to select the one, or maybe to prompt a little bit when I'm reminded to get to a nice and fun one, which is related to what we had together, or whatever it is, right? So I can stop thinking about stuff without stopping to care about stuff. And that's going to be really the key distinction throughout whatever it is that we're going to build. Where do I want to stop thinking about certain aspects, but where do I want to still care? And then there are things where you don't want to care, right? And so the things that you do want to care then inform how you design the role of the human in that partnership, right? In this silly example of the birthday card, I would probably create a system that sort of tries to create a few versions and knows the dates, and then sends me a reminder and says, here are a few things that we could do for Caroline this time around. Which one should we go for? And I'll say, oh, none of them are actually really good because I care. Let's go for number 4. And then it will go ahead and draft a few cards and generate them and then send me, which one do you like? And I was like, oh, okay, 2 is pretty good. Let's send. But thinking about what you want to think about versus what you want to care about is basically the key sort of design space of thinking about agents, right? Start from the limitations in your own memory, intelligence, time, space, energy, availability, and then go ahead and do that. Now, it's worth noting that the whole agentic thinking is not new at all. There's a beautiful theory around the development of language, which basically postulates that the reason for language to exist is because we figured, us being species that are not very strong and not very big and all of that, we figured that our only way forward is to cooperate. In order to cooperate, you need to sort of communicate your objectives, and you need to be uniquely capable of taking on somebody else's goals, right? So for the majority of history, the agents that we've been recruiting into this day are the humans, right? I have some goals, I have some limitations, I can recruit an agent, either talk them into taking on some of my goals or force them to take some of my goals, whatever the method would be, and then they would extend my capacity by doing my bidding, right? And we sort of evolved as a species with this unique capacity to take on other people's goals. Anyway, extending your own agency through sort of tools and agents is what we've been doing since forever. It's just now that we have a new class of agents to recruit and to do our bidding. So this is sort of as precise a definition as I can give you. An agent is an entity that can take on some of your goals and then pursue them autonomously. Autonomously is an important part, and the goals is the important part, because if you have a hammer, right? It's not an agent; it's a tool. That means that it cannot take on your goals. Now, on the other end, let's say a thermostat, right? Your Nest thing on the wall is a minimal agent. Why? Because you set a goal, which is I want the temperature in this room to be 20 degrees, and then it autonomously pursues that goal in the face of changing environment, right? So it gets too hot, it lowers the temperature, turns on the aircon. It gets to whatever, it gets too cold, it turns on the heating, right? So it's stupid. It's really minimal and stupid, but it takes on a goal. So you set an objective. You don't set the exact action every time, and then it does the thing. And then autonomously is a key word, because you go and like you can go out for a week and it will still hopefully keep working. But you have to think about the failure modes and all of that. Now, what you notice is that in order to be an agent, it doesn't have to be very smart. Actually, it can be dumb. And it can have a very deterministic algorithm, right? So your thermostat is not powered by a machine learning model or whatever it is. It can be super deterministic. It can be mechanical, but it still pursues your goals autonomously. And then from sort of the thermostat, you go up the chain of how much autonomy the thing has and how much thinking it can do. To dogs, for example, who are very autonomous and can take on some of your goals, especially if you train them, and all the way up to other humans. So this is kind of the world in which we operate, really. Somewhere between the thermostat and James Bond is the stuff that we're going to build, right? And again, if you think about this, with James Bond, there is so how do I communicate my goal to James Bond, imagining that James Bond works for me? What are the tools that James Bond has in his toolbox and all the other things? Now, I listed here the very important concepts, and we're going to go through them one by one. So bear with me, but this is sort of how we think about those things. So intelligence, right? There is a degree of intelligence between thermostat and James Bond. I don't know how, like, if he is at the top of intelligence, but whatever. You know what I mean? So intelligence really means the capacity to pursue goals within changing environment, right? You don't need to be very intelligent to just sort of to follow the steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you need to be very intelligent to navigate a complex changing environment and still pursue the goal. And so obviously thermostat is very stupid, and then human would be very intelligent. And one of the key design decisions when you're trying to make something agentic is how much intelligence do you want the thing to have versus how much guardrails, right? So how much on rails? What are the things that we want to hard code? Like, you don't want your agent to go off and go into a loop where it's going to spend $100,000, right, or just on tokens doing some stupid stuff. So there you want to put a hard cap. You don't want to make the spending level, or how long it can run for autonomously, a decision that it makes by itself. So that's the autonomy and intelligence that you need to decide. And every time you get to decide, what is it I want to put a hard cap on, hard guardrail, versus what is it that I want the thing to decide by itself, right? And so this is sort of freedom versus responsibility type thing that you will find yourselves deciding again and again. Interface is crucial. Because you can have a super smart agent. You can have a mathematics PhD or physics PhD locked in a room with no way to communicate back and forth. They're not very useful for anybody or themselves, and they're miserable, right? So the interface of how we communicate to the agent, the goals as we discussed, and then how does the agent communicate back to us, either when the agent needs guidance or where the agent has completed or failed. That is going to be crucial, right? For the thermostat, it's a button. You set the temperature, and then that's all you want to do. And then there's an on-off button maybe next to it. For James Bond, you communicate in language, right? So you ask Moneypenny to call him in and say, I need you to go X, Y, Z, and then do things, and you figure out how you do that. I don't care, right? And then when James Bond is done, he probably comes back and calls you and says it's done. So the interface back and forth is verbal. right? And we have a range of interfaces that we'll play with. We'll have the simplest interface when we're programming is sort of just a script where you type in the script and you say, this is what I want to do, and it runs for a few minutes, and then it shows the response back to you in the command line. All the way to the web interfaces that we will build. You can have visual UIs, you can have voice UIs, and again, this goes back and forth. So how do I communicate my goals to the agent is one thing. How does it show it back to me is the other thing. And how does it show the results back to me sometimes creates a lot of value, right? So a lot of the current, when people think about agents, they think chatbots. And that's a significant limitation in terms of the perceived value of the result. So with the exact same thing that I give, so let's say, check how on brand something is, right? It comes back with a long text that you have to read. I don't want to do that. It comes back with a beautiful dashboard visually that says, on this parameter, you're 8 out of 10. On this parameter, you're 4 out of 10. Here are some examples of how you can do that. All of a sudden, that feels valuable. And really, behind the scenes, it's the same information. It's just presented differently in a different format. So a lot of the value, both subjective and sort of objective, of how useful your agent is about figuring out the best interface for the goal, for the task that you're working on. Operating mode. Operating mode is very important in terms of how does it actually operate. What I mean by this is, for example, when you just write a script, its operating mode is I turn the agent on once, and it comes back with a result or with the error, and that's it. That's the life cycle. So that's one way you can do that. An agent that only does something when you ask it to once, and then you have to ask it again, right? In a script or pushing a button or whatever it is. But there is also an operating mode where the agent just constantly runs somewhere in the cloud and pings you every Monday. That's a different operating mode, right? It's there, and its job is to ping you. You can have an operating mode where one agent is monitoring something, and it's not every Monday, but if something changes, it calls you back, right? Super useful. Because again, what are some of the human limitations is we just don't have the capacity to remember too many things. If the agent is there checking whenever you're not in the house, whether the gas is on or not, excellent. It's just doing it. And it's silent 99% of the time, but it pings you if something is wrong. So these are sort of different operating modes that you can think about how it works. Scope of operation, right? What does this thing do? What does this thing have license to do? Right? And these are two different questions. What it can do versus what does it have license to do? And you need to think very carefully about that whenever you're designing an autonomous system or an agent. Cost, right? Again, how much do you want this thing to spend? And cost is not just money. Cost is also time. How much time do you want it to spend on its own, or your time, right? Your attention is a resource that you want to manage. So all of these considerations about the cost, how much or how little do you want to be involved? And that's an interesting part also related to autonomy, which is sometimes making it fully autonomous actually reduces its value, perceived value, right? Sometimes you want to leave the placebo button on because the human, there's the famous IKEA effect, right? You feel much more like the value of the thing feels higher if you took part in bringing it together. So a lot of the human versus agent design and the UX is about that, is how do you make sure that the human keeps a certain degree of agency, real or fake one, which is where I sort of talk about the placebo, because that's going to determine the perceived value for the human, and perceived value is real value at the end of the day, right? That's how people are going to feel. Tools is really the most important part, because the LLM by itself, all it does is it takes in tokens in text or in audio or video, and it sends back tokens in terms of text, right? So it sends back like a string of text. A string of text cannot do shit in the real world. And so sometimes all you need is a string of text, but a lot of the times you need much more. And so this is the tools that you give to your agent, the gun that James Bond gets, or the car, or whatever it is. In the case of a thermostat, the only tools that it has, and tools really, we mean, what are the things that it can do that will affect something in the world? In the case of a thermostat, again, the only tools are the basic one is turn on the heating, turn off the heating. 2 tools, right? When you're designing a system, you need to figure out what are the tools that you're going to give to your agent. So if you want your agent to do research for you, you need to give it tools to go and access the places where it can find the knowledge. It could be on your machine, or it could be in the cloud, or whatever it is. If you want the agent to generate images for you, you need to give it the tools to go ahead and do that. Sometimes it sounds easier to like overcomplicate and give more tools than it needs. And every single tool that it has in the arsenal is a tax. Just like with the human, you put them in a workshop that has like a gazillion tools. They're like, I don't know where do I start? So the Occam's razor sort of applies here, right? You need to keep it as simple as possible, even though everything will scream at you, both yourself and the agent, to like increase the capacity. So try to be lenient with the selection of tools. Data sources are critical because obviously, like right when the LLM is that's driving the agent is working, it's just a giant pile of numbers which represents a compressed version of the whole internet and all that came into the training data. So it knows a lot, but it knows it sort of inside. And data sources are like libraries. So if you want the agent to actually go ahead and, I don't know, check how much money you have in the bank, A, you need to give it the tool to go ahead and access that. B, you need to think about that being a data source with all the complexities that come with it. Oh, do you need to anonymize that data source before you expose that to the agent because it's insecure, right? If you want to build something for the company that you work in that has access to the knowledge bases and best in class slide decks or God knows what else, you need to put in the data sources and the tools for the agent to then access those data sources. Autonomy is basically how much it can do by itself versus how much you want to influence it. We discussed this. Risk profile and failure modes. So risk profile, with James Bond, clearly quite high, but also that's a risk versus responsibility ratio. But you do have to think about how things can go wrong and how things can go right. And I'll talk about that in a second. But failure mode is a very useful concept for all sorts of systems. How could it fail? Right? If I'm designing that agent for birthday cards, one way it can fail is it can send me a card and I just glance on it at 2 a.m. and I'm like, yeah, that's fine. But actually, it depicted the person that I'm sending it to in a very unfavorable way that will upset them. That's a failure mode that I need to think about, right, as I'm designing this use case. Or it can, expose my private data to the internet. Oh, that's a failure mode that I need to think about. So clearly listing the success modes and the failure modes is part of the design. So these are sort of some of the key things that you have to think about. This is my take on how to make an agent. So it starts in the top left corner, as we talked about agents being basically the force multiplier for your own agency. The step one, which is what a lot of people skip and then they're screwed for the rest of their journey, is you have to clearly identify the limits of your current agency. What is it that you're limited in? Now, some people start with the efficiency in mind, right? Which I don't think is the best place to start. They go like, oh, what am I spending too much time on that I don't want to spend time on? But I think that's a limiting question because at the best, you're still there and you just have more time, which is okay. But a much more interesting question usually is, what are the things that I love to have done or to be able to do without thinking about them, but I currently cannot because I have limitations in terms of time, memory, energy, and intellect, whatever. Identifying the limits is key. Like, we'll write with my silly birthday card example, but that's an example of a limitation. Then you define the goal that you want to outsource, right? So the goal would be, in the case of my birthday cards, to basically to make sure that I send fun cards to my friends whose birthdays I always forget. Once you've defined the goal that you want to outsource to this agent, then you have to kind of think one level deeper and operationalize the definitions of success and failure as a UX as a user experience. User stories is basically a format that is used a lot in software development, where you say, as a user of the system, I want to X when Y, right? And simply listing that down, like, as a good friend, I want to send birthday cards to my friends on the day of their birthday. And then you drill that down, right? As a user of the system, I want to be able to preview the card before it gets sent. Listing those things down is really the most important part, because this is how you're thinking about the experience of yourself in this case as a user. Listing down failure modes, as we discussed, is super important. Like how this thing can go wrong. You have to think about that. And then scenarios may or may not be helpful. They're complementary to the user stories, but you can think about sort of the path from the beginning to end. Like user stories are atomic very often. As somebody trying to log in, I need to be able to put in my email and then get the get the password link back or whatever it is. That's a very atomic user story. A scenario is a thing that goes all the way end to end. And then you go to the fourth step, which is describe the target agent behavior step by step. This is the policy part. This is super important, right? Because once you've described what it needs to do, then you can think about how it can do that. So you can think about, okay, the agent should have a policy that if it doesn't know this friend yet, then it should ask me back and ask, okay, what is their name? What is their birthday? What do they like? So that it can store that into the memory. And then next time their birthday comes up, it can remind me. Right? That's a policy. Right? So you're now thinking about how it would do that. Oh, it needs to look, when it's trying to come up with a funny birthday card, it should first look at the description of the person, to try to look into my Gmail and Telegram chats if we had fun interactions before, 3, go online and try to find their picture so that you can use that as a reference. Like, so you start describing the policy of how the agent will go about this. And then really most of the work is done at the top. And the problem that most people get into is when the top part is skipped over and they just start building shit. And that's the problem, because then you're down the path that you did not think through and you did not define, and the thing has its own mind and it will get you somewhere, but it's not going to be really something that you needed. And so once you're there, then you go to the second half, to the bottom half of this chart, and you basically start thinking about, okay, I know what it needs to do. I know why it needs to do that, right? That's the limits of my agency. I know what it needs to do. That's the user stories, and I know how it's going to do that. That's a policy. Once you have that, you can start going, okay, let's think about the architecture. Let's think about the fact that in order to do that, my agent needs to have a module that allows it to store the list of my friends and their associated birthdays. That's a module, right? That's a piece of the architecture. You can draw it on a piece of paper and say, well, there needs to be some storage. Oh, there needs to be a tool for it to go and check my Gmail. Okay, that's a module. Oh, it needs to have a image generation module, like capacity. So that's a module. So you start bringing that down into the atomic modules that the thing actually needs to be made of. It needs to have a daily wake up situation so that it can check, is today's date the date of one of my friends' birthdays? That's a module. And so you start really thinking about those details. Okay, so then you have the atomic modules, and they're all tested individually, and you've written down the learnings, and you debugged the little things that broke, and they will break without waiting for the full thing to break every time. And now is the easy part. You just put the flow back together into some sort of user experience, whatever that user experience may be. It may be a script that you run. It may be a Telegram bot that answers. But you do that end to end. And I would recommend you to do that. Usually, it's not always the case, but I would recommend you to do that from the end, not from the start. If you start building from the top, what happens is by the time you get to the end of the loop, you will have to go through 17 clicks and steps and whatever to just discover every time that the last bit doesn't work. If you start from the end, then every time you're moving on to the thing that you know works. And then ultimately, really, it's just a flow of testing, fixing, deploying against all the scenarios that we wrote down in the user stories, right? So it's very easy to go like, oh, this worked once, fantastic, I go home. No, you go back to your user stories and you methodically click through that, either you yourself or you let Claude do that by controlling your browser or whatever the interface is. And throughout this, it's very useful to keep a file that I call journal MD, where you sort of keep the journal of what you went through, because Claude's memory will peak out. You will start new sessions, you will close it, and having a journal of what you tried before and why you made certain decisions is critical. And again, you'll just ask Claude to write this down, but having a journal of your journey throughout this process is going to be super, super important. Yeah, the last thing that I want to say is I love this thinking from a science fiction writer, not the one that you thought. The original one, Clark, said sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. But actually, Carl Schroeder, who is a Canadian science fiction writer, later on said that actually it's indistinguishable from nature. And I find that a really good guide for how we build these things, because nature is much more adaptive. Nature is sort of, you rely on the thing to work itself out. You build smaller, more self-sufficient modules that then grow up. And so when you're designing a thing, thinking about it sort of growing it rather than building it is a very helpful mindset. At least that's what I found. And making sure that it's the best agent is the one that sort of that disappears, right? That you don't notice. It's just natural. It's there. You communicate with it naturally, whatever your natural way is, and it just does the thing. So don't try to build magic. I would say try to build the things that are supernatural that disappear into the environment. Then they're going to be useful.